Across the shattered spine of Europe, church bells rang without joy. Rifles fired into the air not in battle, but in ritual, their sharp cracks echoing through streets that no longer recognized peace. Banners proclaimed liberation, victory, the end of 6 years of total war. For millions, it was a moment long awaited. The collapse of sirens, ration cards, blackout curtains, and fear. But for a certain group of young women standing in the shadows of German railway yards, this day meant something altogether different. They did not cheer. They did not wave flags. They stood silent beside the tracks, clutching threadbare suitcases, their figures small against the hulking rail cars that waited with open wooden mouths. Their uniforms were the worn remnants of auxiliary service. Gray-green skirts and jackets once issued with pride, now faded, frayed, mocked by defeat. Their boots were cracked, soles peeling, laces replaced by string. Their hair hung limp and unwashed after weeks of retreat, smoke, and sleepless nights. Some were barely 20 years old. Beneath layers of soot and exhaustion, traces of youth still clung to their faces, soft lines not yet hardened by age, eyes too young to carry what they had seen. They had been secretaries, typists, radio operators, nurses, women who had typed orders, relayed coordinates, changed bandages, logged aircraft movements. Small cogs in a vast military machine that had devoured their nation and then collapsed in their hands. Now the Reich was broken. The cities lay open like wounds. Its promises lay buried beneath rubble. And these women were being herded into trains, not for homecoming, but for captivity. The image was surreal. Lines of women in faded uniforms stepped forward under shouted commands, dragging battered suitcases across cracked platforms. These same boxcars had once carried troops east and west, packed with men singing marching songs. Now they swallowed women instead. Some clutched rosaries worn smooth by anxious fingers. Others carried ration tins saved like treasures. Many carried nothing at all. A girl from Hamburg whispered to the woman beside her, her voice thin with fear, "The Americans will not spare us. They will make examples of us." She had heard it from a Luftwaffe officer during the chaos of surrender. He had spoken with the certainty of a man who needed to believe something worse still lay ahead. Another woman, taller, hardened by years spent manning anti-aircraft searchlights through freezing nights, said nothing. Her jaw was set tight, as if already bracing for a blow that had not yet fallen. They had been told this story again and again. That the Allies, especially the Americans, were not men at all but wolves. That captivity would mean degradation, cruelty, humiliation. Perhaps worse. The propaganda had been relentless, filling newspapers, posters, lectures, whispered warnings. The enemy would strip them of dignity. The enemy would punish them for surviving. The trains lurched forward and began their slow journey west. Outside the narrow slits of the boxcars, Germany drifted past like a ghost. Charred towns slid by in silence. Churches without steeples stood like broken teeth against the sky. Bridges folded into rivers. Skeletal factories smoldered faintly, smoke still curling from ruins long after the bombs had passed. Children waved from embankments, their faces thin as paper, eyes too large for their skulls. At night, when the train stopped, the women huddled close for warmth, pressing shoulders together, sharing breath in the cold. They listened to the guards' boots crunching on gravel outside. Sometimes there was the distant crack of gunfire. No one asked why. No one needed to. One woman, Anna, a former secretary from Munich, kept a small diary hidden inside her coat. She wrote by touch more than sight, her pencil moving carefully in the dark. "We are being taken far. None of us knows where. My mother will think I am dead. Perhaps I will be." The journey ended not in a German camp, but in the chaos of occupied ports, Bremen, Le Havre, Cherbourg, harbors bristling with foreign flags. Ships waited under the stars and stripes, their steel hulls towering, unfamiliar, final. The women were marched toward the gangways, past American soldiers who watched them with expressions the women could not read. Some looked curious, others indifferent. They had expected snarls, insults, blows. Instead, there was order, paperwork, lines. They were counted, tagged, divided into groups, names written down, numbers assigned. It felt less like vengeance than bureaucracy, cold, impersonal, almost mundane. Yet as the ship's engines growled to life and the coastline of Europe began to shrink, dread settled deep into their bones. The Atlantic stretched wide and endless, and America waited on the other side. On board the transports, the Atlantic announced itself immediately. Seasickness swept through the holds like a quiet epidemic. The bunks were stacked in steel tiers, narrow and unforgiving, the air thick with diesel fumes and salt. The ship rolled endlessly, a slow, relentless motion that robbed the women of sleep and certainty. Buckets appeared beside bunks. Some women lay motionless, eyes closed, lips pressed tight, afraid that if they moved they would break. Food arrived on metal trays. Pale bread, thick slabs of meat, steaming mugs of coffee. The women stared as if the trays were some kind of test. For years, their meals had been measured in scarcity. Cabbage stalks, turnip peelings, ersatz bread bulked with sawdust and barley, watery soup ladled from rusted cans. Hunger had been a constant companion, gnawing, shaping every thought. Now, in the belly of an enemy ship, abundance appeared without explanation. Some hesitated, convinced it was poisoned. Others devoured the food with desperate speed, tears spilling freely as they tasted real bread for the first time in years. "They feed us like they feed themselves," one woman whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. This was not what they had prepared for. They had expected punishment, degradation, something brutal enough to confirm everything they had been taught. Instead, they were given sustenance, and that unsettled them far more deeply than cruelty might have. As the voyage stretched on, days lost their edges. Time blurred into the rhythm of meals, roll calls, and the endless creak of steel against water. The women spoke little. When they did, it was in fragments. Names of cities, rumors of camps, whispered fears of what awaited them. America remained an abstraction, a land built from propaganda posters and enemy caricatures. When at last the ships reached American shores, New York, Boston, New Orleans, the women gathered on deck, clutching the rails with white knuckles. Skylines rose before them, untouched by bombs. Towers stood whole. Piers bustled with activity. The Statue of Liberty loomed in the distance, her promise twisted into bitter irony. Crowds lined the docks. Some jeered, some stared. Many simply watched. The women were marched ashore under guard, boots echoing sharply on wooden planks. The air smelled different here, cleaner, salted by the sea but untainted by the ash of war. For the first time, some realized how completely their world had collapsed. Germany was rubble. America was intact, prosperous, alive. Buses and trains carried them inland, rolling past green fields and towns that seemed to exist in another reality. Children rode bicycles. Houses gleamed with white porches. Shops displayed goods openly in windows. To women who had watched their cities burn under Allied bombs, the sight was almost incomprehensible. They whispered among themselves. Was this truly the land of monsters? The Reich had promised victory and delivered ruins. The enemy they had been taught to hate appeared to live in a different universe altogether. At the gates of the camps, Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and dozens more, the women were ordered off the vehicles. Names were recorded, possessions catalogued, uniforms exchanged for plain work clothes. The process was efficient, methodical, stripped of ceremony. But before they could settle, there was one more step. The guards directed them toward a low building from which steam hissed and water dripped audibly. The women did not yet know it was a delousing station. They only knew their hearts were pounding. This, they thought, must be the humiliation, the degradation, the cruelty they had been warned about. Whispers spread through the line like static. "This is where they will make us suffer." One woman clutched her suitcase as if it were a shield. Another crossed herself silently. The line moved forward with agonizing slowness. And then expectation collided with reality. Inside, they were handed bars of soap. Real soap. Thick, white, heavy in the hand. It smelled faintly of flowers. Towels followed. Then clean garments. The showers released torrents of hot water that cascaded over skin and hair, washing away months of grime, lice, and despair. Some women wept openly, their sobs echoing off tiled walls. Others laughed nervously, unable to believe what was happening. For the first time in years, they felt clean. It was not humiliation. It was restoration, and it shook them to their core. That night, Anna wrote again in her diary, her handwriting unsteady. We were told we would be beaten, mocked, broken. Instead, we were given soap. How can this be? She did not yet know that this moment, the simple act of washing, would remain etched in her memory longer than bombings, longer than surrender itself. The women lay in their bunks that night, hair still damp, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of starch and cotton. Outside, the American night hummed with crickets, far removed from the thunder of artillery. They whispered to one another, voices low and urgent, as if sharing a forbidden secret. Perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told. Perhaps something here defied both propaganda and fear. As dawn broke over the camp, a question settled among them like mist. If the enemy could show such unexpected humanity, what else waited ahead? The buses rolled through gates crowned with barbed wire, engines growling as pale dust rose along the camp roads. To the women inside, the sight was both frightening and strangely orderly. Guard towers stood at measured intervals. Soldiers lounged nearby with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Rows of wooden barracks stretched neatly across open fields, aligned with a precision that felt almost domestic. This was not the gray brutality they had imagined. This was not a camp of chaos and rage. The buildings were painted, the paths swept, the fences intact but not menacing. The women exchanged silent glances, each asking the same question without daring to speak it aloud. What world have we stepped into? They were filed off the buses one by one. Each woman was handed a numbered tag. American officers moved with clipped efficiency, scribbling notes, stamping documents, calling names. The women stiffened instinctively, bracing for insults or shouted orders. Instead, the guards spoke calmly. Their English carried unfamiliar rhythms, southern drawls, flat Midwestern vowels. For many women, the shock came not from cruelty, but from indifference. They were not treated as monsters. They were not treated as guests. They were treated as something almost unsettlingly ordinary. Prisoners of war to be processed, housed, managed. The delousing station had already unsettled them with its unexpected civility, but what followed was stranger still. After the showers, they were led into a mess hall. The long room smelled of coffee, fresh bread, and something frying in grease. The women froze at the doorway, disoriented by the scent alone. Tables stretched across the hall, laden with trays of food. Boiled potatoes, carrots, beef stew thick with fat, soft rolls gleaming with butter. Steam fogged the windows, an assault of abundance. A guard motioned them forward. Hesitantly, they stepped to the counter. A cook in a white apron ladled stew onto tin plates, slid bread across metal surfaces, filled mugs with coffee. The women accepted the trays as if handling something volatile. Some could not meet the cook's eyes. Others stared at the food, unsure if it was real. In Germany, the final winter of war had reduced meals to black bread mixed with sawdust, watery turnip soup, perhaps a scrap of horse meat if one was fortunate. Now, in the enemy's camp, they were given more in a single meal than they had seen in weeks. Anna sat at a long table, her diary tucked safely beneath her mattress back in the barracks. She dipped her spoon into the stew and watched the grease shimmer on the surface, chunks of meat catching the light. Carefully, she tasted it. Her eyes widened. She pressed a hand to her mouth, suddenly ashamed. Around her, other women hesitated, then ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of cutlery. Tears slid down several faces. One whispered hoarsely, "My brothers starved in the snow, and here they feed us like this." It was not kindness they had been promised by their leaders. It was humiliation, yet humiliation never came. The guards walked slowly up and down the hall, observing with professional detachment. One young soldier, hardly older than the women themselves, offered a crooked, uncertain smile as he passed. The prisoners were unprepared for such contradictions. They had steeled themselves for cruelty. Instead, they faced civility, and it unsettled them far more deeply. In the days that followed, life in the camp revealed further shocks. Each morning began with a bell. Breakfast followed. Then work assignments. Some women worked in kitchens. Others were sent to nearby fields. Some labored in laundries, scrubbing and pressing American uniforms. They were paid small wages in camp script, paper currency usable at the canteen. There, on wooden shelves, lay items that felt unreal. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, pencils, even lipstick. The women stood before the shelves as though before an altar. A bar of chocolate felt like a miracle. A tube of lipstick unthinkable. Yet here it was offered in exchange for work. The irony cut deeply. Back in Germany, their families scavenged for scraps. Cities lay in ruins. Children picked through rubble for crusts of bread. Letters arrived sporadically, smuggled through censorship, filled with despair. One woman read aloud by candlelight, her voice shaking. "We live in the cellar now. The house above is destroyed. We boil weeds for soup. If you have anything, send it." She folded the letter carefully, knowing she could send nothing back but words. The gulf between their suffering homeland and the strange abundance of the camp widened with each passing day. Shame settled over them heavier than chains. They were enemies, yet here they were fed, clothed, sheltered. The Reich had demanded loyalty and delivered hunger and ruin. America, the sworn enemy, gave them soap and stew. The inversion gnawed at them in silence. At night, they lay awake listening to crickets outside the barracks, wondering what it all meant. Some resisted. A few refused to eat, hoarding crusts beneath pillows, convinced the generosity was a trick. Rumors spread, the food was drugged, the soap poisoned. But day after day, nothing happened except routine. Bodies grew stronger. Skin cleared. Lice vanished. Slowly, suspicion gave way to reluctant acceptance. The Americans watched too with curiosity. Many guards had never seen German women except as propaganda images. They were surprised to find them thin, exhausted, frightened, often barely older than sisters back home. One guard wrote in a letter, "They are not what we were told. They look at us like they are waiting for a blow that never comes." And so another conflict began, not of guns or trenches, but of perception. Each bite of bread, each bar of soap, each neutral word from a guard cracked the image they had been taught to believe. The war had ended, but in their minds a new battle had begun. Between memory and reality, propaganda and truth. Anna captured it in her diary with painful clarity. To be treated with dignity by those we were told were beasts is harder than hatred. Hatred is easy. Dignity is unbearable. As weeks passed, the rhythm of camp life settled into the women's bodies. Morning bell. Breakfast line, work detail, supper, lights out. The repetition dulled the sharpest edge of fear. Yet beneath the surface something more unsettling began to take shape. They were captives, yes, but they were also fed, clothed, paid. For women raised in a collapsing Reich, where loyalty had been rewarded with hunger, this inversion gnawed at their thoughts more persistently than any strand of barbed wire. Anna, who had once sat in a Munich office typing orders she never questioned, now worked in the camp laundry. Steam clouded the room as she scrubbed American uniforms smooth, the scent of starch and soap clinging to her hands. Each shirt bore initials stitched above the pocket, names of men who were supposed to be her sworn enemies. As she folded the garments into neat piles, she felt less hatred than an odd, guilty relief. This was work that did not involve war. Work that kept her alive. Sometimes she caught her reflection in the polished steel of the washing drums. Her face looked fuller, her eyes clearer. She barely recognized herself. She wondered, briefly and uneasily, who she was becoming. Other women were sent into nearby fields under guard, harvesting crops that fed both prisoners and soldiers. They felt the sun on their backs, the dirt under their nails, the unfamiliar weight of full baskets. Sweat soaked their collars. Muscles ached. Some laughed softly at their own exhaustion, surprised by the sound. The labor reminded them of villages left behind, of seasons that had once passed without sirens or fire. In the evenings they returned to camp, shoulders sore, spirits strangely lighter. This was not the degradation they had prepared themselves for. It was something else entirely. The camp canteen became the most bewildering corner of their new world. With slips of camp script folded carefully in their pockets, the women lined up to buy small luxuries. Chocolate bars wrapped in brown paper, cigarettes stacked neatly in boxes, jars of jam gleaming red behind glass. The first time Anna bit into a chocolate bar, sweetness exploded on her tongue with a force that startled her. It tasted like childhood, like something lost and then returned without warning. Tears prickled her eyes and she turned away, ashamed of her own joy. A girl from Bremen smeared lipstick carefully across her lips, studying her reflection in a cracked mirror. "I feel human again," she murmured, as if confessing a sin. But abundance carried its own torment. Letters from home continued to arrive. When they arrived at all, each one heavier than the last. Bombed apartments, children coughing in cellars, bread lines stretching into winter. One woman read her mother's words aloud in a trembling voice. "If only we had your American bread. Your brother starves." Silence fell across the barracks. Rats scratched beneath the floorboards. Trays of food sat untouched as the women stared at their hands, shame burning in their throats. Plenty tasted different when shared with memory. The Americans noticed the change too. Guards remarked quietly on how the German women were gaining weight, how color returned to their faces. "They're better fed than folks back home in some towns," one soldier muttered, half in resentment, half in disbelief. Yet rules were rules. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were to be treated to standards that often exceeded those of war-torn Europe. The irony cut both ways. Still, suspicion never vanished entirely. At night, whispers threaded through the bunks. What if this was a facade? What if tomorrow the masks fell and cruelty began? A handful hoarded bread crusts beneath mattresses, convinced generosity was a trap. But weeks turned into months, and nothing changed. No beatings came. No punishment beyond the dull sameness of routine. The greatest cruelty, it seemed, was to be treated decently. Anna wrote again, her diary pages filling with conflict. "I eat and my stomach thanks me. I sleep and my body grows strong. Yet each kindness cuts deeper. How do I reconcile this with the faces of children in Munich who drink water for supper?" Her words echoed unspoken thoughts across the barracks. To be brutalized would have been easier. To be dignified by the enemy was unbearable. Small encounters with Americans deepened the contradictions. One evening during roll call, a young guard dropped his flashlight. Anna bent instinctively, picked it up, and handed it back. Their fingers brushed. For an instant their eyes met. He gave a quiet nod, nothing more. Yet the moment lodged itself in her memory, refusing to fade. Another day, a soldier passing the laundry hummed softly, a tune rhythmic and unfamiliar. A girl from Cologne recognized the melody from a pre-war radio broadcast. She laughed and hummed along. For a fleeting second, two enemies shared a song across a gulf declared unbridgeable by war. Not all guards were gentle. Some looked at the women with open disdain, their eyes sharp with grief for brothers buried in Europe. But even their hostility rarely spilled into action. The women lived in a liminal state, neither punished nor free, suspended between vengeance and mercy. It left them restless, unanchored, unable to cling fully to hatred. Then came the day they were taken outside the wire for work in nearby towns. The women rode in trucks through American streets, eyes wide at shop windows filled with goods, children chasing hoops along sidewalks, men reading newspapers on porches untouched by bombs. They smelled bakeries, sweet and warm. They saw rows of cars gleaming in sunlight. Movie posters plastered brick walls. To women whose last memories of Germany were cratered streets and smoking ruins, the vision was overwhelming. America was not merely intact. It was flourishing. That night, the barracks buzzed with whispers. Did you see the cars? The bread? It was white. The houses untouched. For some, the abundance felt intoxicating. For others, it was unbearable proof of collapse. The Reich that had promised empire had delivered ashes. The enemy had delivered plenty. The conflict that had once been external now turned inward. Loyalty wrestled with reality. Pride with gratitude. Hatred with reluctant admiration. It was no longer a clash of armies, but a slow erosion of belief. Each chocolate bar, each hot shower, each glimpse of an unbroken American street chipped away at the fortress of propaganda. As crickets sang beyond the wire and camp lights glowed like pale moons, Anna lay awake staring at the rafters. She thought of her family boiling weeds for supper. She thought of clean water streaming down her back. Between those images stretched an abyss she could not yet cross. But she knew something within her had shifted. Something irreversible. Autumn arrived quietly, carried on a wind that scattered yellow leaves across the camp yard. Time inside the wire flowed strangely now, marked less by calendars than by the steady cadence of meals, work, and the irregular arrival of letters from home. Yet beneath that routine, something profound had taken root. Survival was no longer the central struggle. Meaning had replaced it. For months the women had lived with the shock of American captivity. The soap, the bread, the baffling civility. Now came the harder reckoning. What all of this revealed about who they had been, and who they might become. Anna sat one evening on the barrack steps, her diary balanced on her knees, writing by the fading light. Her words came sharper now, stripped of the hesitations that had once softened them. I have eaten more in captivity than in all the winters of the Reich. I sleep without fear of bombs. And yet my heart is not at peace. What kind of world is this, where the enemy shows more dignity than our own? Her handwriting trembled. Nearby, a group of women laughed softly, trading pieces of candy, teasing one another about lipstick shades. Their voices sounded almost carefree, as though the war had never reached them. Anna watched from a distance, unable to join. Loyalty to her shattered homeland still weighed heavily, even as it slipped through her fingers. The Americans, too, grew accustomed to their unlikely prisoners. Some guards stopped seeing them as symbols of a defeated regime and began to recognize them as individuals. Thin, stubborn, bewildered, sometimes awkwardly charming in their attempts at English. A few shared cigarettes silently, passing them across the wire with no words exchanged. These gestures were not political. They were human, yet distance remained. The uniforms, the rifles, the fences ensured that. The camp was never free of tension, only softened by repetition. It was beyond the wire that the deepest revelations came. More frequently now, women were sent into nearby towns for labor, escorted but given freedoms they had never imagined. They picked cotton in open fields, worked in canneries, swept municipal parks. Townspeople watched them with a mix of curiosity and reserve. Children stared openly. Shopkeepers peered from doorways. Some faces were cold, others unexpectedly warm. What struck the women most was not hostility. It was normalcy. American life flowed on uninterrupted. Cinemas glowed at night. Grocery stores overflowed. Radios blared jazz and baseball scores. To women whose cities had been reduced to rubble, the sight was almost unbearable. One afternoon, after hours in the fields, Anna's group was brought to a church hall for lunch. Long tables sagged under plates of sandwiches, bowls of fruit, pies cooling on windowsills. The women froze, hands hovering, half expecting the food to vanish. An elderly American woman, flour dusting her apron, urged them gently, "Eat, eat." Anna bit into an apple. The crisp sweetness burst across her tongue, and her breath caught. She had not tasted fruit since 1942. Across the table, another prisoner whispered, "This is paradise." Anna said nothing. She stared at the apple's white flesh, hearing her mother's voice in memory. "Save the peel for soup." The contrast nearly broke her. Back in the barracks that night, conversations turned heavy. Women spoke of families living in cellars, of children barefoot in snow, of brothers lost on the Eastern Front. Some began to say aloud what had once been unthinkable, that perhaps their nation had lied to them, had sacrificed them not for glory, but for destruction. "We were taught they were beasts," one woman murmured, staring at her blanket. "But who are the beasts now?" No one answered. Silence carried more weight than any reply. Gratitude, too, became a burden. They were prisoners, yet alive, clean, fed. They had expected humiliation and found dignity. Soap, showers, chocolate. Each was a token of something larger, harder to name. Mercy, perhaps, or simply a system that had not collapsed under its own lies. Each woman wrestled with these questions alone. Anna's diary became a confession of this inner war. "Hatred is a fortress," she wrote, "keeps the world out. But what they give us, bread, soap, music, slips past the walls. It forces us to see them as human. And if they are human, then what becomes of all the blood, all the ruins, all the lies we swallowed?" She closed the book one evening, chest tight, unable to continue. The guards sensed the shift as well. They watched their prisoners laugh at American films shown in makeshift cinemas, sing along clumsily to radio songs. One sergeant remarked quietly, "You'd forget for a minute they were the enemy if you didn't look at the uniforms." His words carried both wonder and warning. The greatest shock, however, came from the mirror. The women's bodies changed. Faces filled out. Hair regained shine. Color returned to cheeks. Some looked younger, as though captivity had peeled away years of deprivation. To see themselves restored in the enemy's care was almost unbearable. It forced them to confront how deeply the Reich had failed them. The enemy had made them healthy. Their own nation had made them starve. It was not just revelation. It was indictment. And yet, even as laughter returned, unease lingered. Captivity could not last forever. One day they would be sent back, to hunger, to rubble, to families waiting in despair. The thought of leaving abundance for scarcity filled them with dread. More than one whispered at night, "I am afraid to go back." As winter approached, rumors of repatriation spread. The barracks filled with anxious whispers. Would their families recognize them, clean, well-fed, glowing with health earned in captivity? Would they be judged for surviving too well? Anna stared at her diary and wrote words she had never dared before. "I fear leaving more than I feared arriving." The admission chilled her, but it was honest. The enemy's greatest weapon had not been guns or bombs. It had been soap, food, and dignity. And those things had done what hatred could not. They had changed her. Winter arrived with a quiet finality. Frost traced the barbed wire each morning, turning the fences into pale lattices that glittered briefly before the sun burned them away. The camp stood hushed beneath low skies, its routines unchanged, yet charged now with anticipation. Something was ending. Everyone felt it. One morning, as breath rose in white clouds across the yard, the announcement came. A transport would depart soon. Repatriation. The word passed from mouth to mouth like a shockwave. Women gathered in tight knots, eyes wide, hearts pounding with questions they dared not speak aloud. To return meant facing ruins, hunger, and the ghosts of everything they had believed. To stay meant captivity but also life. The guards read names from a clipboard, their voices flat, procedural. Each syllable struck like a blow. When Anna heard her name, she felt a strange hollowing, as if something inside her had already begun to detach. She stepped forward into the cold morning light, her boots crunching on frozen gravel. In that moment, she understood that the true conflict was no longer between nations. It lived inside her. Hatred had once filled that space, solid and certain. Now it was gone, replaced by something fragile, dangerous, and undeniable. Understanding. The women were given time to prepare. They folded issued coats, tied bundles, tucked diaries into satchels. Some moved with urgency, eager to leave before doubt could harden. Others delayed, lingering over small rituals. One last visit to the canteen, one last hot shower, one last taste of white bread. The guards watched quietly. A few exchanged glances, unsure how to mark the departure of enemies who no longer fit the shape they had been taught to expect. One young soldier, the same who had once nodded silently at Anna over a fallen flashlight, stood near the fence as the women assembled. He said nothing, neither did she. Words would have been too much. The buses rolled through the camp gates beneath coils of wire, engines rumbling as dust rose in pale clouds. As the women climbed aboard, they looked back one final time. The barracks stood neat and orderly. The paths were swept. Beyond them stretched fields that had never known bombs. This was not freedom, but it had been something else entirely. As the convoy moved out, the landscape unfolded, green fields fading into gray skies, towns slipping past with quiet indifference. The women sat in silence, each lost in thought. Some wept softly. Others stared ahead, faces set, bracing for what waited on the other side of the ocean. Anna rested her hand on her diary, feeling the familiar shape through worn fabric. She thought of Munich, of streets buried under rubble, of her mother's thin face framed by smoke and dust. She thought of soap, of clean water, of chocolate melting on her tongue. Between those memories lay a truth she could no longer escape. The Reich had promised strength and delivered ruin. The enemy had promised nothing and given dignity. The Atlantic crossing blurred into days of gray water and restless sleep. The women spoke little now. There was nothing left to debate. The war they had fought inside themselves had reached its uneasy conclusion. They would return changed, whether they wished it or not. When at last Europe's coastline rose again on the horizon, it looked smaller than they remembered. Broken, fragile. The ports were scarred, the cities hollowed. This was home. As the ships docked and the women stepped onto familiar soil, they felt eyes upon them, not hostile but searching. They were thinner than they had been months ago, yet healthier, cleaner, restored in ways that would invite questions no one wanted answered. Some would never speak of America. Others would speak only in fragments. But none would forget. Years later, long after uniforms were discarded and camps dismantled, the memory endured. Not of barbed wire or guards, but of contradictions. Of soap handed across a threshold. Of bread eaten in silence. Of dignity granted where humiliation had been expected. History would record their captivity as a footnote, a logistical detail of post-war occupation. But for the women who lived it, the experience had carved something deeper. It had dismantled certainty. They had learned how easily hatred could be taught, and how devastating it was when reality refused to obey it. For Anna, the lesson remained etched deeper than any bomb scar. She would carry it through rebuilding, through scarcity, through the long years of reckoning that followed. The war had taken much from her, youth, illusions, faith in simple truths. But captivity had given her something unexpected. The knowledge that humanity could survive even where lies had been planted most carefully. And that knowledge, once learned, could never be surrendered.